Their journey began under the harsh Texas sun where camaraderie, courage and discipline were born. This was Piotr, and this was the beginning. In the vast sun-scorched plains of West Texas, where the wind whispers through tumbleweeds and the sky stretches endlessly above, stood Piotr Army Air Base, a place few have heard of, but where many young men came of age. By early 1943, Piotr, nicknamed Rattlesnake Bomber Base, had become a vital training ground for one of the most powerful weapons of the Allied air campaign, namely the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Constructed in record time after America's entry into the war, Piotr buzzed with activity. Crews trained day and night, learning to fly, navigate and survive in the heavy bombers that would soon thunder across the Atlantic. Many were just boys, barely out of high school, suddenly faced with the responsibility of a war. Here future missions were forged into sweat and sand. The base hosts thousands of airmen who practiced formation flying, gunnery drills and emergency procedures, honing the teamwork that would define their survival. Piotr may have been remote, but its impact was global. From this dusty outpost, B-17 crews like those of the 381st Bomb Group took their first steps toward combat. Eventually many would find themselves stationed in England and flying into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. On July 24, 1943, the American base at Ridgewell, England, awakened at dawn. The base was the home of the 381st Bomb Group of the 8th Army Air Force. Officers and men woke up at around 0600 hours in the sleeping quarters barracks called Nissen huts. The barracks looked like giant water pipes dug halfway into the ground. 32 enlisted men shared one hut, while the officers only had to sleep 16 in theirs. Everybody knew that there was a mission that day, but only a few knew the destination. Speculation started as always. They all hoped for that easy target, a milk run, but also knew the dangers if it turned out to be the German Ruhr area. This was the 11th mission for the 381st Bomb Group. The 8th Air Force had been in England for about 13 months, but the 381st only for a couple. Crews that already had 5 or 6 missions credited were considered veterans. The group had already lost planes, so everyone knew the feeling of losing friends as well as the joy of a successful mission. Out by the runway, the ground crews had started preparing the aircrafts for the mission. 500-pound bombs were loaded into the bomb base, cartridge belts were put into place, and the engines were being started. In the canteen, the kitchen staff prepared breakfast. The crews dressed in the flight gear. Some had electrically heated suits to prevent them from freezing in the cold airstreams that always came through open hatches and gun windows. Flies prepared themselves in different ways. Someone polished a medallion, another pocketed a picture of his family or friend. Many smoked, and everybody went to the bathroom. Breakfast was served in the mess hall, and those who had stomachs for it ate as much as possible. Afterwards, the officers rushed to the morning briefing. Briefing before a mission. The room where the briefing was held was much the same way as the mess hall. There was a small podium at one end, and the officers sat on folding chairs in neat rows, just like kids in a school auditorium. They had pens and paper ready to take down important information regarding today's mission. The commanding officer of the 381st Bomb Group was Colonel Joseph Nassaro. He entered the podium and greeted the men. "Gentlemen, today we have an important mission. The target is Norway," he said. The flyers made remarks in low voices as their colonel continued to give them the facts for the mission. Maps were shown, and high-altitude photos of the targets were displayed. The officers were told the group would fly into the area of Oslo, the capital of Norway, to bomb a factory held and maintained by the German occupants. 9 bomb groups would fly this mission, 180 airplanes in all. Simultaneously, 2 other raids would be conducted by other groups, making the total number of planes going to Norway 309. Anti-aircraft installation called flak in the area was estimated to be few. Flight time was to be 4 hours one way, approximately 1,100 kilometers or 700 miles, the longest mission for the group up to that point. After this somewhat overwhelming information, the flyers were sent on their way. They left the building to go out to the aircraft and meet with their crews. The Georgia Rebel. Aircraft number 423217 was a Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress. It had the code letters MST and the nickname Georgia Rebel. She, a plane was always a she, probably got the name from the fact that her pilot was from Georgia. He was a southerner and wanted the name of the plane to connect with his background. She was a very slim and nearly shark-like airplane with a pointed nose and streamlined shape. Many consider this to be one of the most beautiful airplanes ever built. She was dark green with a light grey undersurface and had the markings of the United States Army Air Force with a white star on a dark blue surface. Her letter codes and number were painted in grey and yellow respectively. On the upper half of the tail sat the letter L in a white triangle, the identification mark of the 384th Bomb Group. Georgia Rebel did not sport a picture of a lightly dressed girl as many others did, but she did have 5 red bombs painted on the nose, signifying she was ready for her 6th mission. The pilot was First Lieutenant Oscar Vernon Jones, 27, one of the most experienced in the group. The navigator was Second Lieutenant Arthur Lawrence Girton. The rest of the crew included a flight engineer gunner, a radio operator, and 4 gunners. 2 replacement members flew that day, Second Lieutenant Charles Wesley Nevius, 24, Bombardier, and First Lieutenant George Burnett McIntosh, 22, crew pilot. McIntosh was operations officer of the 535th Squadron and occasionally filled in as needed. With everything checked and all battle stations manned, the order to start engines came. The planes taxied out towards the runway like 2 rows of waddling geese, then took off with 25-second intervals. Heavy loaded with bombs and fuel, takeoff was critical. Any mishaps could be fatal. But all went well, and the formation climbed through the clouds towards the rally point off the coast of England. In late morning, 167 American Boeing B-17 bombers attacked the industrial site, dropping approximately 1,650 bombs. The main target was the partially completed light metal factory intended to supply aluminum for German warplanes production, particularly bombers. The factory was so thoroughly destroyed that magnesium production at Herøya did not resume until 1951. Although air raid sirens had sounded several times in the month prior, no attacks had materialized. Hydro had set up a crisis command center staffed by company leadership and key personnel. At 12:44 on July the 24th, the air raid siren rang again. It was a very hot summer's day with around 1,100 workers present, fewer than on regular weekdays. Fertilizer production was ongoing and construction of the new light metal plant was well underway. The B-17 bombers attacked in several waves. Many workers reached air raid shelters in time, but 2 people were killed in a stairwell on the way down. Of the 1,650 bombs dropped, around 600 hit the Herøya Peninsula. The aluminum and magnesium plant were obliterated, the saltpeter factory was heavily damaged, and PEA was struck by 38 bombs. The scale of the destruction forced Hydro to abandon the light metal project, and a new factory was not completed until 1951. But the destruction extended beyond the factories. The nearby residential area of Snardalstrand also sustained significant damage. Buildings burned, debris littered the area, and thick smoke hung in the air. Rescue and recovery operation began immediately. By Saturday night, dead and injured had been found. The deceased were brought to Østre Porsgrunn Church Chapel for identification. A total of 55 people were killed and at last 100 injured. Among the victims were civilians outside the industrial site, including 8-year-old Reidun Bjørk Nordfjordmark, the only child and only female victim of the attack. Reidun was killed just weeks shy over her 9th birthday. Of the 55 dead, 33 were workers on the new aluminum and magnesium factory. 22 died in a surface-level shelter housed in a brick building that offered inadequate protection against the force of the explosions. Here are some photos of Reidun and of her grave, and of the house she was in when a 200-kilo bomb struck the neighboring home. Reidun opened the door just as the blast wave pulled her out and the debris came crashing down on her. My grandfather Anton was searching desperately for my uncle that day. He eventually found him in a rabbit hutch in a nearby yard, scared to death. The bombing itself was a mistake. The planes had passed over Ånnerød, releasing the bombs too early. They expected the bombs to drift down onto Hydro, but instead they fell straight onto Stranda, right where Reidun lived. MACR 132 or MACR 132 states AC 42-32117 was damaged severely by flak over the target, but bombed and was seen to leave formation at approximately 14:15 at 57 degrees 20 minutes north, 7 degrees 30 minutes east. Number 2 engine was threaded. The prop was observed to be bent, and a hole was in the port wing, near the gas tanks, with gas leaking out. Number 3 engine was smoking and losing oil. The aircraft did a 180-degree turn, and at a heading of 40 degrees true was seen flying in the general direction of Sweden. Confirmation teletype received. The crew landed safely in Sweden.
För att vi var som sagt, vi var ute och körde hö. Ja. Och så vart det en väldig dundring och så kom det till planen. Så kom så lågt. Och det kom väl som därifrån då, över Mösen. Ja. De försökte väl, tänkte jag, att landa på Mösen. Ja. Där då. Ja. Men det var det jämnt här bort att det var något där, så de var där och tittade. Ja. Det låg där ganska länge. Det var en som hette Ola Persson och han kunde engelska. För de som landade där, de trodde de var i Norge. Och det var ju de var rädda då förstås, för det var ju krig i Norge, tyskarna. Jo, men då kunde han engelska. De var så nöjda för då visste att de var i Sverige.
Hidden among the quiet forest near Årjäng, Sweden, Långelanda Tinghus stands as a weathered wooden witness to centuries of rural drama. This modest courthouse was built in the early 1800s and long served as the administrative heart of justice in Värmland. Within its wooden walls, local disputes over land, inheritance and honor were argued and decided. Yet beneath its surface, one of Sweden's most notorious criminal cases unraveled. A case tied not to bandits or brigands, but to a trusted man on the cloth. Enter Anders Lindbäck, ordained vicar of Silbodal in 1862. Ostensibly gentle and pious, Lindbäck came under scrutiny in 1864 after several parishioners fell gravely ill, and then died shortly following his communion visit. Authorities eventually convicted him of 3 murders and at least 3 attempted murders, all allegedly by poisoning the communion wine with arsenic, targeting the poor to reduce the parish's final burden. Lindbäck confessed in June 1865 and was sentenced to be beheaded. Before the sentence could be carried out, he took his own life in the cell in November that same year. And yet Långelanda Tinghus survived these scandalous shadows. Georgia rebel crash-landed in nearby Venaka after a bombing run over Norway. The crew was brought not to jail, not to interrogation, but to Långelanda Tinghus. Inside the familiar walls of law and order they were offered hot coffee and sandwiches, a neutral refuge in wartime Sweden. So this humble courthouse, once a stage for poisoned communion and courtroom fury, transformed into a place of quiet compassion, where once a man of God stood accused of murder. Now weary airmen were met with unexpected kindness. Today Långelanda Tinghus stands silent but layered. It's a living tapestry of rural justice, scandal and sanctuary, a building where the sacred and profane have crossed paths and where war and mercy have unexpectedly embraced.